My husband laughed loudly with his friends. I'll BR dump her after she pays off my $80,000 debt. One friend whispered, she's right behind you. I smiled and said, you'll be paying with interest to a lawyer. They all went silent. My name is Dana Ridley. I'm 41 now. I work at Regions Hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota, in administration. It's not glamorous, but it pays well, and I've always liked structure. I'm the type who uses color-coded calendars and has a backup key hidden under a fake rock on the porch. I like predictability. I never considered myself romantic or impulsive, not after my first marriage ended when I was 29. That was messy, full of screaming matches and stonewalling. I thought I'd learned my lesson then, to look for stability, to avoid drama, to never lose myself in someone else again. But life has a CRL way of testing you right where you think you've grown the most. I met Tobin at a 4th of July barbecue. He wasn't my type. That's what I told my friend Anika as I watched him laughing too loudly with a bottle of craft beer in hand, sunglasses perched on his head like a guy who always needed to be seen. But Tobin noticed me in a way that felt intentional. And after so long of feeling invisible, that attention, it was intoxicating. He said all the right things. Talked about owning a few properties, flipping houses, investing in up-and-coming areas. He wasn't just charming, he was convincing. Told me he'd grown up in the cities, knew the business like the back of his hand. There was a certain ease to the way he spoke, like everything in his life was unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. And for a while, being with him made me feel like maybe things in my life were, too. We started seeing each other regularly. He would show up with takeout when I had long shifts. He knew how to make me laugh when I was overwhelmed, how to calm me down when I spiraled into my usual anxieties. He had a way of making the world feel smaller, more manageable, like we were on the same team. 6 months in, he moved into my place. 11 months after that, we were married in a small ceremony on the patio of a vineyard outside Red Wing. It was fast. Everyone said so, but I told them it just feels right. I remember the look my mom gave me, a kind of hesitant smile. She didn't say anything, just squeezed my hand. The first real issue came shortly after the honeymoon. Tobin pulled me aside one night, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and told me there'd been a hiccup with his credit. Something about a project in Duluth that fell through a couple of years ago. He said he was slowly paying it off but was struggling with high interest rates. Then he asked if I'd consider consolidating some of his smaller debts onto my credit card, just temporary, he said, so we weren't bleeding money to the banks. It was $6,000. I remember sitting on the couch, calculator in hand, checking my available credit. He kissed my forehead and told me I was the smartest woman he knew, that this was just a stepping stone, that we were building something bigger. And I wanted so badly to believe it was true. That $6,000 turned into $15,000 over the next few months, then $30,000. And every time I asked questions, he had an explanation. Clients who hadn't paid on time. A deal that was tied up in probate. One time, he said a business partner in Bemidji ghosted him with $20,000 of shared investment. It always sounded just plausible enough. What scared me wasn't just the growing debt, it was how easily I started brushing aside my gut feelings. Every time I hesitated, he'd call me too anxious, or remind me how much progress we were going to make once he closed the next big deal. I didn't want to be the nagging wife. I didn't want to be the one who doubted. So I kept swiping my card. I took out a personal loan. I paid for a seminar he said he needed to attend in Denver. He promised to pay me back in full within the year. I was now over $80,000 in debt. Some nights I would stare at my bank account, trying to calculate how long it would take to climb out of the hole. I started skipping coffee runs. Stopped going out to dinner with coworkers. I told myself it was temporary, that love sometimes looked like sacrifice. But Tobin started changing. He was out more. Stayed vague when I asked where he was. I noticed texts from names I didn't recognize, just initials or first names only. Let me call you back, messages at midnight. When I asked, he sighed, told me I was being controlling. That I didn't trust him. And I didn't. Not anymore. But I didn't want to admit that. Not yet. The night everything changed was a muggy Saturday in August. Tobin said he was going to meet a few of his old buddies from high school. He left around 6:30 p.m., said he'd be back by 10. Something in his tone was off, too cheerful. I sat on the couch with a bowl of pasta, pushing it around with my fork. I couldn't shake the feeling. So I did something I'd never done before. I followed him. I waited 20 minutes, grabbed my keys, and drove to the bar he mentioned, the Golden Lantern on Grand Avenue. I parked 2 blocks away and walked. When I walked in, I spotted him instantly. He was in a booth at the back with 3 other men, laughing the way he hadn't with me in months. I hung back, hidden behind a support beam. I was close enough to hear bits and pieces of the conversation over the low music and clinking glasses. One of the men leaned forward, grinning. "So, when's the big breakup, man?" he asked. "You gotta be nearing that 100K mark, right?" Tobin laughed, loudly. Too loudly. "After she pays off the last chunk," he said. "I mean, come on, who else would cover 80 grand for a guy who doesn't even sleep in the same bed half the time? She's practically begging me to use her. Honestly, it's been too easy." I didn't hear what the others said. My heart was pounding too loud. Then, one of them must have noticed me. I'll never forget his face, pale, like he'd seen a ghost. He nudged Tobin and whispered, "She's right behind you." Tobin turned. And I just stood there. He blinked, opened his mouth, maybe to lie, maybe to run, I'll never know. But I smiled, calmly, coldly. "You won't need to break up with me," I said quietly. "You'll be paying me back. With interest. To a lawyer." I walked out. My hands were shaking when I got back in my car. My mouth was dry. But I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. The first night after I left that bar, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the guest bed with my phone in my lap, staring at it like it might give me answers. I remember the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the glow of the streetlight through the blinds. My chest was tight, like I couldn't take a full breath. Tobin didn't come home that night. No call. No text. Nothing. And weirdly, I didn't expect him to. I think we both knew that something irreversible had happened. That night, his lies had run face first into my silence, and for once, I had let the silence speak for me. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Ray Tilden, recommended by a coworker who'd gone through a BR-tal divorce the year before. She wasn't warm, but she was sharp. Within 10 minutes of our first meeting, she'd pulled a legal pad from her desk drawer, flipped through a folder of sample cases, and started drawing up a timeline. I laid it all out, the debts, the credit card transfers, the forged applications I suspected, the way Tobin always insisted on handling our shared financial documents. She listened carefully, rarely interrupting. At one point, when I mentioned the bar conversation and what Tobin had said, she looked up over her glasses. "Do you have any kind of recording of that?" she asked. "No," I said. "It happened too fast." She tapped her pen. "We might not need it. Especially if we can prove a pattern of financial manipulation or coercive control. Do you have documentation?" "Emails, texts, screenshots of bank activity." "Yeah," I said. "Plenty." The following weeks were a blur of paperwork. Ray helped me pull credit reports, compile a list of debts that had accumulated during the marriage, and trace where the money had gone. She contacted forensic accountants who could verify signatures, match IP addresses to application locations, and confirm what I already suspected, some of those loans. He had applied for them himself, using my information without my knowledge. That made it criminal. Meanwhile, Tobin finally resurfaced, 3 days after the bar. He walked into the house like nothing had happened. He dropped his keys on the counter and opened the fridge. I stood in the doorway. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and steady. He sighed, like I'd just asked him to help bring in groceries. "Dana," he said, "look, I know you were mad the other night." That wasn't how it sounded. I raised a hand. "Don't." He paused, blinked like he couldn't believe I was interrupting him. "You used me," I said. "You lied. Repeatedly. You put debt in my name. You bragged about it to your friends." "That's not true," he snapped. "You're twisting it. You always overreact to everything." I felt a flicker of that old insecurity rise up, the one he used to fuel, the one that made me doubt myself. But this time, it fizzled out just as quickly. "My lawyer will be in touch," I said. And I walked out of the kitchen. He didn't follow me. That surprised me, a little. He stayed at the house for another week, sleeping on the couch. We barely spoke. He acted like this was some temporary blip, like he just needed to wait it out and I'd calm down. Then the legal notice arrived. Ray served him the initial filings for divorce, along with a cease and desist related to the financial fraud. That's when he finally left. Packed 2 duffel bags, slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows, and didn't look back. Good riddance. But his departure didn't mean it was over. Not even close. The court process was grueling. Ray filed for an annulment on the grounds of fraud. alongside a separate civil suit demanding restitution for the money taken during the marriage. We had to gather every document, every transaction, every receipt, and communication from the past 3 years. I had to go through old emails, bank statements, even birthday cards he'd written, anything that might reveal motive or pattern. And then came the deposition. He showed up in a wrinkled suit, with a new lawyer, some guy who looked about 12 and who clearly thought I was going to fold the moment someone questioned me. Tobin didn't make eye contact when he walked in. He sat across from me at the long conference table, arms folded, eyes fixed on a spot just over my shoulder. His lawyer asked questions like, "Isn't it true you willingly opened the credit cards?" "Yes," I said, "but under false pretenses." He said he'd pay me back. "Do you have that in writing?" "No," I said, "but I have texts where he discusses repaying me. I have voice memos. I have transaction records showing money moving from his accounts into mine and back again, enough to show a pattern." They tried to paint me as careless, emotional, naive, and maybe I was, but I wasn't stupid. Not anymore. Tobin, for his part, didn't say much. He barely looked at me. When he did, it was with a kind of exhausted resentment, like I'd inconvenienced him by refusing to keep being his bank. I could feel the pity in the room. Even the court reporter seemed uncomfortable. I thought facing him would make me angrier, but instead, I felt something I didn't expect: grief. Not just for the money or the years lost, but for the version of myself I had been with him, a woman who'd bent over backwards, convinced love was supposed to feel like carrying weight without complaint. That wasn't love. That was exploitation. And somewhere deep down, I had known it. I'd just been too afraid to admit it. Ray warned me that court could take months. Tobin had filed a countersuit claiming joint ownership of my condo, even though I'd bought it 4 years before we met, and demanding half the value in the split. It was laughable, but still something that had to be fought. Every motion delayed things. Every rebuttal added stress. I stopped sleeping through the night. Started waking up at 3 a.m., panicked over things like missing documents or whether I'd remembered to sign the right line on a form. Work was a blur. I kept my head down, avoided conversations, lied when people asked how I was doing. I said I was tired or busy. No one ever pried. But the loneliness, it crept in slowly. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the unraveling of an entire belief system I had built around second chances, redemption, and trusting again. Some evenings, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at nothing. There were moments where I questioned if any of it had ever been real. Had he ever loved me? Had any of it, the laughs, the vacations, the stupid inside jokes, meant anything to him? Or was I just a mark? Just the next name on a list of people he could drain and discard? Those thoughts were the hardest part. Not the debt. Not even the court. It was the doubt. The silence. The not knowing. And still, something inside me had shifted. A tiny voice that had once been drowned out by guilt and anxiety was growing louder. I wasn't going to let him win. Not legally. Not emotionally. He had taken enough. Autumn hit St. Paul with sharp winds and golden trees. I remember the first cold morning after the deposition. I was sipping coffee by the window, and the backyard had that frost on the grass look that makes you want to stay inside all day. I watched a squirrel dart along the fence and realized it had been weeks since I'd paid attention to anything outside myself. I wasn't okay, but I wasn't falling apart either. And that was something. Ray called me 2 days later. "He's trying to settle," she said. I nearly dropped the mug. She walked me through the offer. Tobin's lawyer proposed to waive his bogus claim on the condo if I dropped the civil suit. No restitution, no admission of wrongdoing, and of course, no consequences for the debt. I stared at the phone like it had personally insulted me. "He thinks I'll cave," I said. Ray didn't say anything for a beat. Then, "He's counting on you being tired." He was right about that part. I was tired. In my bones, in my head, in every part of me that had carried this weight silently for months. But I wasn't giving him what he wanted. "Reject it," I told her. We moved forward. The case gained traction slowly. Tobin's paper trail was messy. He'd mixed business expenses with personal ones, transferred money through dummy accounts, and had a history of being just clever enough to avoid charges, but not clever enough to cover all his tracks. The forensic accountant we hired found 3 different instances of his signature on loan documents supposedly signed by me, but the timestamp data didn't match. He'd signed them from an IP address in northern Wisconsin when I was at work in Minnesota. The cracks were showing. Meanwhile, I was trying to rebuild. Quietly. I started seeing a therapist named Annalise, a quiet woman with short gray curls and kind eyes. She didn't offer easy answers. She asked hard questions about my past, about why I'd ignored red flags, about what I thought love was supposed to look like. Some days I left her office feeling raw, like I'd been picked apart. But I kept going. I cleaned out the closets, donated half the clothes I hadn't worn in years, found 3 of Tobin's ties still hanging on the back of the bedroom door. I took them to Goodwill without blinking. I changed the locks. I deleted old photos. I put a small corkboard in the kitchen and started pinning up little moments of progress, a bill paid off, a kind message from a friend, a night I actually slept 8 hours. Tiny victories. One day, Ray called again. Her tone was different this time. "We've got him." She walked me through the forensic evidence. The fraud claim was strong enough to move forward. The bank had agreed to cooperate. She'd spoken to the state attorney's office. There might be criminal charges. I should have felt relieved. I should have cheered. But I felt heavy, sad even, because in some twisted way, this man had once been the person I shared my dreams with. My home, my bed, and now he was someone I was taking to court. Someone I was hoping would get charged. That kind of grief doesn't come with a guidebook. Still, I pressed on. Court dates were set. Hearings were scheduled. His lawyer filed motion after motion to delay. I kept showing up. My hands would sweat through every hearing, my throat dry as dust. But I stood my ground. At work, I finally told a few coworkers the truth. I didn't give them the whole saga, just enough to explain why I'd been so checked out. Most of them blinked in stunned silence. A few offered hugs. One woman, Melissa, started bringing me coffee every Monday just because. Survival juice, she called it. I began to breathe a little easier. Then came the unexpected. One night, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi Dana. You don't know me, but I dated Tobin a few years ago. I heard what happened. I think we should talk." I stared at the message for a long time. Her name was Mia. She lived in Duluth. Said she'd met Tobin when he was doing a real estate project up there. Said he'd charmed her, borrowed money for a business expansion, promised to pay her back, and vanished with $12,000 of her savings. Her story was nearly identical. I called Ray the next day. She lit up like a Christmas tree. "Pattern of behavior," she said. "Let's see if she'll testify." Mia was hesitant at first. Said she didn't want to relive it. But eventually, she agreed. She said if it helps someone else avoid this, it's worth it. The next month was a slow-motion storm. More evidence. More delays. More emotional whiplash. One night I stood in the kitchen, pouring tea, and realized I hadn't thought about Tobin in 3 days. Not with anger. Not with longing. Not at all. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time after being underwater. The courtroom smelled like old wood and carpet cleaner. I sat at the plaintiff's table, back straight, papers neatly stacked, hands folded tight in my lap. Ray sat beside me, calm and focused, flipping through notes with the kind of quiet confidence that made me feel like maybe I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was prepared. Tobin walked in 5 minutes late, his suit too tight across the shoulders, tie crooked. His face was thinner, more drawn than I remembered. I caught a flicker of recognition in his eyes, not regret, not guilt, just calculation. He thought he could still talk his way out of this. That was his mistake. The judge called us to order. Over the course of 2 days, we presented everything: the bank records, the forged documents, Mia's testimony, delivered via video with shaking hands and a determined voice, the pattern of manipulation, the financial exploitation, the texts, the timelines. Tobin's lawyer squirmed through his cross-examinations. There was only so much he could say. The facts spoke too loudly. At one point, he even tried to blame me, said I'd consented to the financial arrangements in the relationship. I remember the judge raising an eyebrow and asking, "Is consent valid when it's gained through deceit?" The silence that followed was the kind you could fold and keep in your pocket. By the second afternoon, Ray delivered her final statement. "This isn't just about money," she said. "This is about deception, manipulation, and exploitation repeated across multiple relationships. This is about a woman who trusted the wrong man and paid the price, but who stood up and said no more. We ask that the court recognize that wrong and correct it." I didn't look at Tobin while she spoke. I looked at the judge. When the decision came, it was quiet. No gavel slam. No dramatic pause. The judge ruled in our favor. The marriage was annulled on grounds of fraud. Tobin was ordered to pay restitution, the full $80,000 plus $12,000 to Mia, with interest and court fees. His fraudulent loans were flagged for investigation by the Attorney General. And as a cherry on top, the condo remained solely in my name. No appeals allowed. Tobin stared at the table like he was trying to process how it had all slipped through his fingers. I stood, gathered my things slowly. He glanced up, just once, and I gave him a smile. Not smug, not CRL, just solid, like steel. Outside the courthouse, Ray clapped me gently on the back. You did good, she said. I exhaled for the first time all day. The weeks that followed were quieter. The story spread in little ripples through people we'd both known. Tobin's reputation, already shaky in the business community, was gone. Word got around fast. Don't lend to him. Don't work with him. Don't trust him. One afternoon, Mia emailed me a picture, a snapshot of a storefront with a handwritten "closed for good" sign on the door. Thought you'd like this, she wrote. I did. Back home, life began to slowly stitch itself back together. I started cooking more, something I hadn't done in years. I took a weekend trip up north with Melissa and Anika, where we drank wine by the lake and laughed about terrible dates we'd survived. I even rejoined my book club, the one I'd quietly ghosted during the worst of it all. There was no parade, no dramatic epiphany, just a lot of quiet mornings, clean finances, and peace. One evening, I stood in the kitchen, staring at that corkboard I'd hung months ago. I took one of the last blank pins and wrote something on a scrap of paper before tacking it in the center. I didn't stay quiet. And I never would again.